Thank you to Jessica and for GESIS for the invitation. Very happy to be here today. So I'll try to aim for 40 minutes with the actual talk here, and then hopefully we'll have enough time for questions. And I'd like to have some back and forth about the different topics that we'll be discussing here. So the major topic of the talk today is really, we've long understood interviewer effects in surveys, but what don't we know right now, and what directions can we move in to try to both understand these effects and try to mitigate these effects in future surveys. So that's really the focus here. And I'm going to talk a lot about like open areas for research gaps. So some of you may be working on research proposals or even dissertations or whatever the case may be. There are a lot of areas for work on interviewer effects. This is by no means a dead area. So Bob Groves was one of my mentors, and when I first met him, he thought that it was trending to be a dead area, but I think there's been a lot of work going on lately to kind of revitalize research on interviewers. So I want to provide an overview. Got to figure out where to stand here. I want to provide an overview of some recently published, ongoing, and needed future research on the effects that interviewers can have both on the quality of survey data and the quality of survey paradata. So data describing the data collection process, and then related survey estimates. And again, I've tried to highlight in red kind of open areas, open questions, gaps for future research. So you'll see those in the different slides. And I'm happy to share the slides so Jessica and Dorothy and others can distribute them. I have a lot of references at the end. And I want to provide initial answers to 4 research questions that have received only minimal attention in the literature to date. There have been nearly 100 years of research on interviewer effects, but again, there's still some unanswered questions that we can think about. So we're gonna organize the talk by 4 questions, and the first question is, if we think about interviewer variance, what's the relative decomposition of interviewer variance into sampling error variance, non-response error variance, and measurement error variance? So if we think about the total survey error framework or paradigm, at what stage of the data collection process is there variance among interviewers that gets introduced, and how can we understand that decomposition? Furthermore, if we're not dealing with truly interpenetrated designs, where each interviewer gets a truly random subsample of the entire overall sample, how can we even begin to study this if there's sampling error variance to begin with, just because interviewers are working in different areas? So that's the first major question I want to think about. So Kristen Olson and I, back in 2010, this is another funny story about Bob Groves. I sent an email to Bob saying, well, how do we know that interviewer variance isn't just interviewers recruiting different types of people and then doing a really good job with the measurement? And he sent me a 1-line reply that said, interesting. And that led to this paper. So we analyzed data from a telephone survey in particular, where we had access to true values on the sampling frame. And this was actually a sampling frame of official divorce records. So we had kind of gold standards for our measurements. And so one question that came from this is, if you're studying non-response error variance among interviewers, to which interviewer should a telephone survey non-respondent be assigned? Do they get the first interviewer to make contact, the last interviewer to make contact? What if it's a non-contact? So we tried a couple different methods. We also pretty much showed that we did have interpenetrated assignment within calling shifts. So there was random allocation of sample to interviewers within different calling shifts at different times of the day. We found evidence of significant total variance for certain variables, but most importantly, that total variance was being driven by non-response error variance among the interviewers. So here's a picture. In the panel on the left, the 2 box plots, these are weighted estimates of the interviewer errors in terms of non-response and measurement. So based on the true values, how different was an interviewer's mean based on the respondents that they recruited. And the left box plot here is the variability of the non-response errors among the interviewers. This then is the variability of the measurement errors among the interviewers, because we had access to true values. And so this was for a variable mean age of divorce, to suggest that the interviewers were working with people of different ages, potentially. But that wasn't the case for every single variable. Others, there was more variability in the measurement errors. Okay, so there's not a consistent story. Different variables lead to different types of decompositions like this. So we said, well, this was a telephone survey. It was a very specific case. Can we try to replicate this study using a face-to-face economic panel survey? So we went with the PASS study here in Germany. And in a face-to-face setting, we would expect larger interviewer effects. Also, we expect that interpenetrated assignment is not feasible in a face-to-face setting, giving everybody these random subsamples. So the models that we used to study this decomposition, we needed to adjust for PSU level covariates, area covariates, things about the areas that may introduce variance to begin with. I just want to emphasize, and again, this is highlighted in red, what to do in the absence of interpenetrated sampling is a very important open question. How can we estimate interviewer variance? There have been some proposed methods, but simple adjustment for area level covariance to try to understand this phenomenon is not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. So we have to think about other approaches to dealing with or isolating the interviewer variance in these non-interpenetrated designs. So we took the covariate approach, but not ideal. Out of 11 survey variables, we found 5 that had significant total interviewer variance. So passes, they've long understood again that interviewer effects exist, and we'd like to try to understand why that is. Variance in simple reports of age was once again driven by non-response error variance. So it's not that the interviewers are bad at measuring age, and some interviewers are better than others at asking how old you are. It's the fact that they're recruiting different types of people. And the implication of that is any variables related to age, having a strong relationship with age, will also demonstrate non-response error variance. So that's, again, a repeated or replication of that finding. Variance in benefit receipt reports, so are you currently receiving unemployment benefits, was driven by a mix of non-response error variance and measurement error variance. So it wasn't entirely one or the other. For that particular variable, it was a mix. And the other 3 variances were driven primarily by measurement error variance. So that's still a problem. I'm not to say that measurement error variance is not a problem, but the key is trying to understand for a given variable where that variability is coming from, because there are different implications for training depending on whether it comes from non-response error variance or from measurement error variance. Okay, so a very recent study that we've been conducted with somebody that we stole from Germany, Felicitas Mitterder. She's one of my PhD students right now. We conducted a face-to-face original data collection in Germany, in 15 geographic areas in Germany. And this was actually an experiment that was built into this face-to-face data collection. So what we did is within each of these 15 areas, we randomized 2 interviewers to be trained in conversational interviewing methods. And we randomized 2 interviewers to be trained in standardized interviewing methods. So conversational being more flexible. You can carry out a normal conversation. Standardized, they have to read the script as is. And we found out that in PASS, actually, conversational is really the more accepted norm in Germany. And there's nothing like that in the U.S. In the U.S., everybody has to use standardized interviewing. And so in each of the areas, we had 2 of each type of interviewer. So we had 30 of each type across the 15 areas. And we wanted to compare these 2 groups of interviewers in terms of the interviewer variance that they introduce and the same types of decompositions to see if these different interviewing techniques introduce different amounts of variance. Now, with this design, conditional on the area, we did use truly interpenetrated sample assignment. So we took a sample from the IEB databases, the employment databases here. We randomly assigned addresses to the 4 different interviewers working in each area, 2 conversational, 2 standardized. So conditional on the area, we did have truly interpenetrated sampling. So first question was, does the conversational technique introduce more variance? This was something that people had speculated about, but no studies had actually attempted to show this. And Mike Elliott and I developed a likelihood ratio testing approach for comparing different variance components across different groups of interviewers that I'm currently working with Jessica on while I'm staying here. So what we found is that conversational interviewing does tend to increase interviewer variance, but only slightly. So not as large or not to the extent that some people think. We found that 5 out of 55 survey or paradata variables that we analyzed had significantly higher interviewer variance for conversational interviewing. So only really 1 out of every 10 roughly, or 1 out of every 11 had higher variance. And this is just a scatter plot that kind of shows this relationship. This is the estimated intra-interviewer correlation, or as the literature might call it, rho int, in the CI group, the conversational group on the y-axis. This is the estimated IIC for the standardized group on the x-axis, and each dot is a given variable. So we had this kind of comparison. You can see a lot of them tend to lie on this kind of 45-degree line. Anything above the 45-degree line would suggest that conversational introduces more interviewer variance, or a higher within interviewer correlation. And I circled the 5 out of the 55 that showed the largest differences between standardized and conversational. So you can see that for 4 of the variables, number of rooms in your housing unit, how many hours you work per week, the longest period of gainful employment in the past 20 years. You can think if somebody asked you that question, how would you answer it? And a lot of opportunity for the interviewer to intervene. And then social networking question. What is the count of close friends that you had outside of your household? Okay, more room for the interviewer to interact. And then up here, you can see way at the top, these are IICs of approaching 0.4. in both groups. You say, what would that be? It's interview duration. So the fact that some interviewers are really fast, some interviewers are very slow. In the case of the conversational technique, as we might expect, there was more variability here for the group that was allowed to be more flexible. Okay, but these are astronomical IICs, and that's something that's also a concern is why do the interviewers vary so widely if they were given these truly random subsamples in terms of interview duration? So CI was also found to shift response distribution significantly and in the direction of higher response quality for 14 of the 55 variables. So that's consistent with the literature, the idea that being more conversational will give you higher quality responses. So that was consistent with what we know. And for those items that had administrative data available in the IEB database, the increase in the interviewer variance from the conversational approach did not offset the gains in mean squared error due to the higher response quality. So we looked at bias and we looked at variance, and we found that the gains in terms of bias, or the reductions, if you will, due to the conversational approach, were not offset by the increased interviewer variance introduced by conversational in terms of overall mean squared error. So that was a reassuring finding. So that just looked at the total variance, and the other question we want to answer with these data was, what about that decomposition, and does it look different for the two different interviewing techniques, given that we had this kind of randomized assignment? So we looked at 3 items in particular that we found to have substantial interviewer variance overall based on the respondent reports, and again looked at that same kind of decomposition here. So this is the first variable that we focused on, once again, age. Okay, something very simple where we're not going to make the argument that for a very factual, direct question like age, interviewers are having measurement difficulties or any correlates of age. And once again, in the conversational group, these are just showing the interviewer errors across the 3 stages of the data collection process: sampling, recruitment, and then measurement. Look what happens to the variability in recruitment in the conversational group. First row is conversational, second row is standardized. Once they get to the recruitment stage, they're just picking up people of different ages, okay? And that persisted. There was not a single problem with measurement, but if we focused only on measurement, we'd step back and we say, why are they having such a hard time measuring age? This is the whole issue, okay? There's variance coming from an earlier step in the process. So we don't want to make the argument that conversational interviewers are necessarily bad at measuring age, but at the same time we want to ask the question, if they're trained to be conversational in measurement, are they somehow more conversational in recruitment? Or do they somehow mislead people, or whatever the case may be, when they're trying to recruit them? And that is still an open question. How does their training in terms of measurement translate to what they do during recruitment? Here's a different variable. This was log transformed annual income. You can see that in the conversational group, there were hardly any interviewer errors at all in terms of at any step of the process. But then in the standardized group, you can see when they got to measurement of that particular variable, annual income, here we see evidence of substantial measurement error variance. So the standardized group is also not completely free of interviewer variance either. Okay? It doesn't just come from conversational interviewing. This was a case where if they were using a standardized procedure, it seems that they had a difficult time measuring in some cases, or they may have relied on their own devices. The literature suggests that standardized interviewing can lead interviewers to deviate from the script because they feel uncomfortable when they're acting like a robot in front of a real human being. So that may well have been what was going on here, especially when you're asking somebody to tabulate what their annual income was. And then finally, here's a variable that was measuring the longest period of sustained employment in the past 20 years. Once again, the conversational group, nothing happening in terms of sampling or recruitment, but when they got down to measuring, this is where there's evidence kind of against the conversational technique. When they were trying to collect these reports, there was a great deal of measurement error variance introduced in that conversational group. The ICC was about 0.07, about 7% of the variance was due to the interviewer. So that was interesting. And then in the standardized group, there was slight evidence of non-response error variance here for this particular variable. And interestingly enough, when they conducted measurements, that variance was more or less attenuated at the measurement stage. So that suggests that most of the standardized interviewers were collecting responses that were closer to the mean. So what seemed like non-response error variance was actually getting canceled out a little bit when you got to the measurement stage. So interviewers were collecting basically more of the same information rather than what the respondents were actually looking like in terms of this particular employment measure. So you again can see this mix of different decompositions depending on the variable. And what these results really suggest is that survey managers can't ignore the possibility of non-response error variance. Okay, we've now had several studies that have shown that non-response error variance can play a role in introducing significant total variance. And I think that there could be more procedures for monitoring this kind of variability live. So thinking about, for a given interviewer, are you tending to recruit different types of people as the data collection proceeds? And can we step in during the data collection process if it seems like you're only recruiting older people or younger people or whatever correlate we're interested in looking at? Furthermore, standardized approaches are not entirely free from significant measurement error variance. Okay, we found substantial measurement error variance for both standardized and conversational. And again, I think there's an opportunity here for survey managers and survey production individuals to monitor this kind of variability in a live fashion. On an ongoing basis, fit different models to the survey reports that are coming in and being processed, and see if particular interviewers are having extreme deviations in terms of the responses that they're collecting. And this offers an opportunity to intervene on a live basis if it seems like there are particular survey items where an interviewer is having a very difficult time or collecting responses that deviate substantially from the overall mean. So this is certainly still an issue. And especially in the case of conversational interviewing, this could be due to uneven implementation of that technique. And again, there could be room for additional retraining if we can look at some recordings of the interviews or whatever the case may be to understand, are the conversational interviewers going off on tangents? You know, are they trying to be too buddy-buddy with the individuals, establishing rapport, establishing a friendship, as opposed to just asking the questions in the way that they should be asked? So if we think about where to go in terms of these decomposition ideas, again, there's a couple important questions. And this is an important statistical question is, again, how do we handle this lack of interpenetration, especially in face-to-face surveys? So I'm currently working with Mike Elliott at Michigan on a couple different ideas. One is called anchoring. And the idea of anchoring is that you adjust your estimates of interviewer variance components for within subject correlations of residuals on some anchor variable, as I italicized there, that's known to be free from measurement error. So something like age, where you wouldn't expect the interviewer to have a hard time measuring age. But for each individual in the data set, you would have two records. This is what's unique about this idea. You'd have one record where you have their measure of age, and then you have another record where you have a variable that's prone to interviewer effects, something like self-reported health or employment or something like that, where you can fit a model that allows the residuals for both of those variables to be correlated if you standardize those measures. The idea is that if there's something going on at the sampling or recruitment stage, and you're essentially reordering the ages of the sample just by the interviewer to who they recruited or who they were assigned, and there's a correlation of age with the other variables that you're primarily interested in, there's going to be a correlation of those two residuals, the residual for age and the residual for the variable of interest. And by estimating that within interviewer correlation of those two variables, you're essentially taking out the piece of the interviewer variance due to the fact that there was either sampling error variance or non-response error variance. And what's left after modeling that correlation of the residuals is what's really and truly due to the interviewer, assuming that those two variables are highly correlated. So we've tried that in one study so far, and I'll show you some results here in a second. Another idea is from kind of causal inference and the idea of propensity score matching, where you treat the interviewers as your treatment groups, essentially. And you come up with a propensity of being assigned to each interviewer, and by accounting for those propensities in analysis based on other covariates, you essentially come up with a balanced sample across the interviewers, the same way that you try to balance treatment groups and propensity score matching, just in a multivariate setting rather than two different groups or something like that. So this would be a weighting approach based on a multinomial logistic regression or something like that that would give you the probability of being assigned to a particular interviewer given your different covariates. And then we would adjust our estimates based on those weights. So different ways, again, just to remove the lack of, or the amount of the variance that's due to something aside from the interviewers. This is just a picture of what we did with the anchoring illustration. These are design effects or interviewer effects, multiplicative changes in the variance of an estimate due to the interviewer. Here, we have an unadjusted design effect without that anchoring idea built in. And you can see that these variance inflation factors based on row int range from 1 to 4 before we incorporate any kind of adjustment. After we model that within interviewer correlation of the residuals based on that anchor that's not prone to interviewer effects, you can see what happens to the majority of these variance inflation factors. They all drop below that 45-degree line. We're removing some of that row int that's really due to just differential assignment or differential recruitment. And you can see consistent reductions. In some cases, there are increases, but for the most part, there are consistent reductions when we just use this one anchor. This was a very simple method where we use self-reported health and age, but we feel like there are a lot of different directions in which this could go, thinking about regression models, other descriptive problems. This was just one simple illustration based on data from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system in the US. So each of these points was one state in the US and what happened to the interviewer variance for self-rated health before and after this particular adjustment. So I think that's an interesting idea. And then here too, another research question based on this is how do we efficiently model measurement error variance and non-response error variance simultaneously? So in the papers that I've talked about so far, we use very simple methods where we fit one model at each stage of the process. And we didn't allow for correlation across the different stages. The idea, for example, that non-response error and measurement error may be correlated across the stages. We assume that the different steps of the process were completely independent. So one idea that we have, and this is all at the proposal stage, so I'd love to talk more about this further. One idea that I had is we could first impute responses for any of the non-respondents using whatever auxiliary information we have available for the full sample. And then we could use multi-level models to estimate interviewer variance in two things. The non-response errors, and we could do that by having a predictor that's coded 1, -1, so effect coding for respondents and non-respondents. So give each interviewer their own unique non-response error via that covariate. So model variance in the effects of that covariate on the outcome, and then also measurement errors or variance in the intercepts among interviewers. And the nice thing about the multi-level modeling framework is we could allow the coefficients for this effect-coded outcome for non-response and the coefficient for the intercept here to correlate with each other. So we could build in that correlation of the interviewer-specific non-response errors and measurement errors and estimate the covariance of those two error sources as a part of this modeling. So this is currently, again, at the proposal stage, but we've done some initial simulations to suggest that this can do a great job of picking up on that non-response error variance, and the fact that if we ignore this covariance and do the kind of descriptive stuff we've done in all the papers so far, we actually overstate estimates of the interviewer variance because we're failing to account for the covariance of these error sources across the different stages. So I think this too has promise, and we actually currently have a proposal with the U.S. National Science Foundation to try to take these ideas further. So we're hoping to hear back about that probably at the end of August. But I'd love to talk further about that. Furthermore, variance decomposition for regression coefficients. This is a big issue with interviewer effects in general. Almost 100 years of literature is primarily focused on descriptive estimates, means, proportions, very simple descriptive quantities. But if interviewers can affect individual variables, why can't they also affect regression coefficients, which many of us are interested in, right? If they can affect an important predictor, what does that mean for the relationship between two variables, and how are they affecting regression coefficients? So I'm going to come back to that in a second. And furthermore, do different interviewer-administered modes of data collection have different variance components, kind of like I looked at in the conversational versus standardized study. So if you're comparing Caddy versus text message interviewing, or Caddy versus Kathy, or Caddy versus ACASI, or different modes involving interviewers, do those different modes ultimately introduce different variance components? Again, like similar to what I'm working on with Jessica to see if different training techniques and so forth introduce different types of interviewer variance components across studies. So a lot of these, no longer assuming that there's just some overall rho int across all the different aspects of today's multivariate survey environment, but allowing for the different design aspects to affect the interviewer variance and seeing what those differences look like. Okay, so that's a lot on the first question, and I'll try to get through the other three questions here. There's not as much has been done on these last three questions, so as you'll see here in a second. So the second research question is focusing on the paradata question. So we've talked about measurement, we've talked about recruitment, and so forth. But this question is, how do interviewers affect survey paradata? And these are things like interviewer observations of the interview process, or interviewer observations of the area or the neighborhood, or things like this, features of the data collection process, records of call attempts, so how often they visit particular households or how often they make particular calls, and then also post-survey observations. So for respondents only, was the respondent engaged? Did the respondent think very hard about the questions? Was the respondent friendly? Things of this sort. Do interviewers vary in terms of what they record on those post-survey observations? And what design or training strategies can be used to reduce the effects of interviewers on these different paradata? The issue here is that error-prone paired data can be quite problematic for non-response adjustments and also potentially various types of responsive survey designs. If we're using these auxiliary variables to try to tailor our efforts to particular cases or follow up with particular cases, and we're using auxiliary variables that are quite prone to error coming from the interviewers, that's going to affect the decisions that we make in the field. And we want to try to prevent that by studying these interviewer effects. And there's a couple simulation studies I've looked at just to kind of demonstrate how bad that can be. So together with Frauke Kreuter in 2013, this was related to my dissertation work, we looked at we found significant interviewer variance in the quality of interviewer observations of particular household features. And this was, we validated these household features based on completed rosters. So we said, why would that be? Like, why do some interviewers vary in terms of the quality or the accuracy of this type of observation? And in this case, it was whether or not the interviewer thinks there are young children present in a given household. It's a very important auxiliary variable for a study that we're working on right now that looks at family fertility. And so we sought to identify predictors of observation accuracy at the respondent, interviewer, and area level. So we want to take all different features of respondents, interviewers, and areas into account to try to understand if there was still evidence of interviewer variability. And we found that. We found that there was significant variance in the observation accuracy that remained. And this kind of motivates the next couple studies that I'll be talking about to try to understand, well, what are the interviewers doing differently from each other that even when we account for all these covariates, they're still producing observations that vary widely in terms of accuracy. What exactly are they doing in the field to introduce these differences? And this echoed results reported by Jen Sinibaldi and Frauke and Gabby Durant in the 2013 paper as well. They found the same thing in the UK. Okay, so this is a constant phenomenon, or at least it appears to be. This is just a graph demonstrating what we found. What you see here is a stacked bar chart. Each of the stacked bars is one of 94 interviewers that we were studying in our current survey. The white bar is the percentage of the observations that they made on the presence of young children that were accurate based on household rosters. So the white bar is the accuracy. The gray bar, those are false negatives, and the black bar, those are false positives. So if each bar is an interviewer, you can see the substantial variability across them. This one interviewer, for example, is at about 60% accuracy. This interviewer is at about 90 or 92% accuracy. What's the difference between those two interviewers? And you could say, well, maybe it's the areas they were working in. Maybe it's the features of their respondents. This variability remained after we controlled for the fixed effects of all of other features. So again, the question arises, why? Why do the interviewers vary like this in terms of making these kinds of observations? So we'll come back to that here in a second. Frauke and I have also tested the idea of giving interviewers asked to make these kinds of judgments observable predictors of what they're trying to judge. Okay, so another really bizarre question that we ask in the National Survey of Family Growth in the U.S. After the interviewer completes the screening interview to see if there's an eligible respondent within the household, we ask the interviewer to record on their laptop whether they think that that selected respondent for the eventual main interview is currently in a sexually active relationship. Okay? So based on what they learned during that particular screening interview, what they saw, do they think that that person is currently in a sexually active relationship with a member of the opposite sex? And what we see is, again, substantial variability in these judgments, and we can validate these judgments based on actual survey responders when the interviews are completed. And so what we did is we fit a model trying to identify predictors of that survey report and then provide the interviewers with those predictors if they were at a complete loss. So if they didn't actually meet the person who was selected or they didn't learn much from the interview, they could take a look at a list of important correlates of this particular judgment and then make an informed decision. So what we found is that providing that information to all the interviewers in the final 2 quarters of data collection for this cycle of the NSFG substantially reduced those false positive rates for these judgments. You would tend to err on the side of, in this population, people being sexually active. We were able to bring those false positive rates way down by making them think about what they had learned, what they'd seen so far before they make this particular judgment. And so we've implemented that in all quarters of the NSFG since to help the interviewers if they're at a loss on this particular observation. The key being that we're trying to help them with what might be a pretty difficult task when they're asked to make these observations. Another idea would be to replace these observations with predictions. If they're working in very hard areas where it's difficult to observe these features, maybe you could just use whatever auxiliary information you have available to try to develop some kind of prediction for what that observation should be, rather than asking them to consistently collect this everywhere that they go. So that idea also needs evaluation, which is why I highlighted it in red here. Okay, so we've seen so far in a number of studies that the interviewers vary substantially in their ability to correctly judge these different traits. Are there kids in a household? Is a selected respondent currently sexually active without prior training or guidance on the observation process? So one possible source of this variance is that they're using different strategies or picking up on different cues in the field, maybe based on what they know about the social world or how they think it's organized, the way they were brought up, whatever the case may be. There may be some native built-in ideas about what it means to be sexually active or what a house with kids present should look like or something like that that they're relying on in the absence of any prior training on how to do this. And so what we started doing in the NSFG was not only asking the interviewers to record these observations, but asking them to record justifications. So if you think that somebody's sexually active, why is that? What did you see? What cues did you pick up on to make that kind of judgment? If you think there's a kid present in the house, why? What did you see about the household? Or what cues were you drawing on to make that observation? And so in the case of this sexual activity judgment, we looked at almost 4,000 of these open-ended justifications, and then we coded them for the types of cues that were present to see if interviewers were varying in terms of what they were looking for. In the end, we coded 13 different indicators, and we found that there were 4 unique clusters of interviewers. We did a cluster analysis based on how often they used these particular indicators in their justifications. We found that those clusters varied significantly in terms of judgment accuracy. So interviewers who tended to look for particular features were also more accurate in their observations. In other words, the interviewers who were picking up on certain types of cues tended to be more accurate. And that's what we kind of suspected was going on, but this was the first real evidence that that was happening. And it wasn't really rocket science, right? Those who were able to pick up, for example, on relationship status in those screening interviews tended to be more accurate. If they saw a wedding ring or they saw, I have in the paper, like one interviewer's example judgment, well, I saw a tattoo on his chest because he wasn't wearing a shirt that had a heart with Carol and an arrow going through the heart. So he's like, I looked at that and I said, he's probably in a sexually active relationship with Carol, given that tattoo. So I said, yes. So, but those are the kinds of things. Did they look at appearance of the respondent? Did they look at features of the housing unit? Like another interviewer said, there's no way that a lady could ever come to this house because I saw dog poo everywhere and the house smelled horrible. Again, something that survey managers are not going to know about or see because the interviewers are eyes and ears out in the field. So, I mean, again, not rocket science, but like things that you might expect to predict being in a relationship proved to be so. And this was another larger example of this investigation. So together with a couple of my graduate students and building on the prior work that we've done, we coded more than 45,000 of these justifications for observations on presence of young children. But not only that, but also interviewer guesses to estimated response propensity. So do you think that this household is very likely to respond, partially likely to respond, or not at all likely to respond? And why do interviewers vary in terms of those guesses as well? And again, the objective here was to understand what cues were the interviewers looking for in these particular justifications, and did they explain variance in the accuracy of the two observations. Once again, we found that the interviewers tended to vary substantially in terms of the types of cues used, and more so across the NSFG data collection periods, a given interviewer tended to use the same cues. Again, evidence for this kind of native built-in strategy if they're not giving any kind of training or guidance in this area. This was true regardless of the type of area being worked by the interviewer, urban, rural, inner city, outside the city, suburban. It didn't matter where they were working. Response propensity estimates tend to be more accurate in urban areas. Young children estimates tend to be more accurate in rural areas. So there were certainly area level correlates of accuracy, but we were most interested in, again, the cues being used. This is just a picture showing that regardless of where an interviewer was working, they varied substantially in what they used. These are two interviewers working in the biggest metropolitan areas in the U.S., two different examples. And this is the percentage of their justifications that cited general no evidence of children. So not something very specific, but just saying I didn't see any evidence in general. I had a general impression that children weren't present. One interviewer, close to 70% of the time, across 8 different quarters. And again, they're both working in the same metropolitan area. Another interviewer almost never said that and said other kind of cues all the time. Okay? So again, why is this, are they using these different cues consistently? Is this a source of the variance in accuracy? Answer was yes. So for the response propensity estimates, the types of cues used explained about 54% of the unexplained variance in accuracy among the interviewers. And for the young children estimates, the types of cues used explain 42% of the unexplained variance in accuracy among interviewers. And this is after controlling for area, respondent, and interviewer level characteristics. So this is above and beyond accounting for all those other features. So these results are all available upon request in terms of what cues were most effective, but the identified cues provide direct practical guidance for training. So just some examples. Don't only think about the housing unit, but think about features of the area where you're working as well when you're making these observations. Check with neighbors. Note a general lack of evidence of children. Don't note toys. The interviewers who only look for toys when looking for young kids were consistently the least accurate. Okay? Never guess. Interviewers who just chose to guess for whatever reason, also the least accurate. So some interesting findings, but again, with direct implications for training. So the literature also shows evidence of substantial interviewer variance in post-survey observations, like I was mentioning earlier, in call records. So I'm working on another proposal with Ting, Jan, and Kreuter to try to explore this problem in more detail if we want to use these observations to understand the quality of respondents. So there's a lot of future work that's needed in this area to understand if these observations are useful in general and what predicts variability in the quality of those observations among different interviewers. Okay, so briefly, I'm just going to summarize the last couple questions here. The third question is, do interviewer observations add predictive power in panel surveys? Because I know many of you are working on panel surveys as a part of GESIS. Above and beyond, using survey measures collected in previous waves. So this is, are we getting unique additional variance explained or additional power for non-response adjustment above and beyond what we learned from previous waves? And together with Dr. Mark Chapman at the IAB, Frauke and I did this study looking at data from the past collected over time. And we built in interviewer observations on the income bracket of a household in Germany and also whether the interviewer thinks that somebody in that household is receiving unemployment benefits. And we wanted to see if those would be predictive of eventual survey responses in later waves above and beyond prior wave measures from the survey. We found that the observations actually picked up changes over time that were not accounted for by using prior wave measures. So if the status of a household was changing over time, income or unemployment status, these observations were picking up some of this unique variance. So that was an interesting finding. And we found that they did have a correlation with the survey measures of interest in a later wave after adjusting for other covariates. The problem is they weren't correlated with response propensity. So if we're thinking about non-response adjustment, we have this nice feature that they're predictive of survey responses, but they didn't also predict response propensity. So PASS has a fairly high response rate across different waves, and we'd like to replicate this study in other panel surveys with lower response rates across the different waves to see if these observations may also serve to predict response propensity and therefore be used for non-response adjustment. The last question I've already kind of alluded to is how do interviewers affect the quality of estimated regression coefficients? So again, the vast majority of the literature in this area has considered the effects of interviewers on simple descriptive statistics. To our knowledge, there are 3 papers that we've identified that we think have addressed this kind of multivariate question, and all of them have focused on respondents only. So not considered, again, this kind of decomposition question across the different stages of the data collection process. The most recent paper focusing on data from the European Social Survey. And again, all these citations are at the end of the slide, so you can see them. So what we did, and this is under review right now, with a graduate student, Fischer, we designed a large simulation study to look at interviewer effects on both a dependent variable y and some predictive variable x in a very simple linear regression model. So we just start with a simple slope and intercept model and see what's happening here and how those effects can impact estimates of simple linear regression coefficients. We also looked at data from that conversational versus standardized study to have a source of administrative data for validating our estimates, again, across the different stages of the data collection process. So we looked at a real data application. Just to summarize the key findings, the most important factors were the relationship of the dependent variable with response propensity, and that's not new, that's not known. So we know that bias can come from that. But in terms of regression, interviewer variance in the reported values of X was a big driver of the quality of that coefficient. So also not really new. We know that if there's measurement error variance in an important predictor, that's going to attenuate estimates of regression coefficients. Again, people have known that for 50 years. The key here is that if we think about it as coming from interviewers, we can adjust for that in practice. And nobody ever does that, which is kind of head-scratching. The real data application echoed these results, okay, from what we were seeing from the simulation. So we can actually adjust regression coefficient estimates based on the reliability ratio that builds in estimates of interviewer variance components. It's very simple to do. We illustrate how to do this in the paper. It's, again, something that's been known for years, but we can get an estimate of that interviewer variance from the data that we have. It's very easy to just build that into our estimation process. We need an estimate of simple response variance, the variance of the measurement errors for individuals for a full correction, but we found in the application that this correction based on interviewer variance repairs the vast majority of the bias in estimates of regression coefficients. So it'd be something very easy to build in practice when we suspect that interviewers are affecting predictors in regression models. So tons of directions here. This entire slide's in red. Do interviewer effects on Y and X play a similar role in logistic models, ordinal models, Poisson models, multinomial models? We're just considering simple normal linear regression. What if multiple predictors are affected by interviewers, not just one? Okay? What correction should be used in that case? Does this appear to be the case in other kinds of studies? Do we see the same evidence of this kind of problem if we have access to validation data? Or do we still see evidence that interviewers are affecting regression coefficients? And if so, can we use these kinds of simple adjustments to repair that question? So I really feel like this is both a statistical and kind of a social sciences problem. Can we extend this literature in the direction of multivariate analyses and think about not only mitigating interviewer effects on descriptive estimates, but what we should be doing in terms of thinking about interviewer effects on regression estimates too. It's very important because it really boils down to it. Most of us are looking at regression models anyway, not just looking at simple descriptive estimates. So all of this stuff is in red because I think it all needs important work. So I'm really open to ideas and suggestions on any of these topics. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak today and spend some time here at GESIS. So I'm very thankful for everybody that I've worked with so far and met so far. So hopefully we can have a good discussion. Any papers that you'd like to see that I've alluded to here, just send me an email. My email is pretty simple. It's just bwest@umich.edu. I really want to thank everybody for coming today. And if you ask for the slides, there's a list of every paper that I've cited throughout the different research questions here at the end. And like I said, I'm happy to share any of these papers with you electronically if you shoot me an email. Okay, so that was about 42 minutes, so not quite 40 minutes, but that's a lot. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to have questions. So. Definitely should not have worn a long sleeve shirt. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation.
Yep.
You talked a lot about the possibility to correct or to control for interview variances. And the issue I learned from the early papers by Fox, Observer, and so on is to use multi-level analysis. Sure. You did not mention that.
Yeah, all of these studies use multi-level models. Yeah. So all of them use the same general analytic techniques that you and others have outlined in their papers on multi-level analysis. So all the studies that I mentioned for these 4 research questions were using multi-level models that controlled for interviewer characteristics, area characteristics, respondent characteristics, and so forth. So a lot of the variance decomposition, we wanted to see whether the variance of the random interviewer effects could be reduced due to the type of study they were working on or whatever the case may be. So all of these different studies have used that machinery to do that. So certainly. Sure. Yeah, thank you again for the presentation. I was wondering, if you're interested in this area, usually you look at some area. And you also talked about the level of implementation. Right. So I looked at using a self-satisfied multi-level model, where the random effect on the area and random effect on the user. Do you have any experience with what for a level of implementation that is needed that these kind of models still work? Or yes. Yes, there's a paper that just, I didn't do this study, but there's a paper that just came out that provides that exact kind of value. Yeah, no way. Oh, you probably read it, yeah. No, in our context, the studies that I've worked on, since you've already heard about that paper, the studies that we worked on all involve nesting. So interviewers never cross different areas. They're always isolated to just one area. So for a lot of these models, we're using strictly nested models, not cross-classified models. But in that context, I just read that paper the other week, and they provided good guidance on how much interpenetration you really need. I basically, because I haven't done those studies, I can't like match that or echo that. I haven't looked into that before, given those kinds of cross classified designs. So, but that too, I mean, it may be the case that you don't need 100% interpenetration to still be able to estimate that variance. And I think if we have the opportunity to work on that anchoring idea a little bit further, that's a question that we could study. But I haven't had the opportunity yet. So that anchoring thing is just kind of a brainstorm that we wanted to look into further. So it's all the proposal study.
Thank you, Brady. Interesting. The question is about the research question one, where you presented like an option to analyze measurement error and limit error together.
Yeah.
And you said to impute data that is missing on the auxiliary variable, based on auxiliary variable.
Right.
Which one would be like used for that, or do you?
Yeah. So. A fundamental issue there is that to do those imputations, so if you think about it, you're going to have a full sample. And in some of the studies we've worked on, I've had the fortunate opportunity to have administrative data available on the sampling frame. So like for example, our study with conversational versus standardized, we had the true values in the frame. So that'd be the ideal situation. You have really strong correlates of what was not reported by the non-respondent. But more generally, it'd be a question of what pair data, what other, is it commercial information that you could link to the frame? What is it that you could add to or enrich your sampling frame with to give you good predictors of what these survey reports should be, so that you have a good way of identifying, what those reports might be for non-respondents. Again, like if we're able to work on this technique, we could see how strong that correlation would need to be to get a good estimate of what that non-response error variance is. Because obviously, if those imputation models are poor, we're going to do a bad job of understanding the non-response error variance among interviewers. So those imputation models at the very first step would need to be very strong. We need to find good sources of all that information and make this a reality. So we'd like to start with one of these studies where we already have that kind of administrative data available on the sampling frame. But part of this question would be, how strong those correlations really need to be to echo what we might find in simulation. So we've only really used simulation so far. That would be part of extending the simulation. See, at what point does that correlation become so weak that you get a bad estimate of that non-responsive event? So we've looked at that a little bit so far, but if we get funding to do this work further, we could look at a whole gradient of different correlations and see what really matters in those implications. It's a great question, and it's an open question. Oh. Yeah, like that's kind of what I'm working on with Jessica right now at GESIS while I'm here for this week or so, is to try to understand, is it the general features of the pools in terms of experience or age or other sociodemographics, or is it the way that they're trained that might be introducing this different variance depending on different studies using different training methods and things of that sort? I think Jessica's working on a very interesting research problem in that regard and trying to understand the role in. Right now we're just trying to understand the total role based on the survey reports, but you could extend the idea that she has to look at the correlations of these study-specific features of the interviewer pools with Rowan to say, what about the decomposition? So if there's a certain kind of training used in a particular study, is Rowan being dominated by non-responsive, depending on the type of training that was conducted? Also a great question. That's something I think that she's working on an interesting approach to that. So that's an area that needs more work as well. And those of you who work on the ESS or PIAC or these other studies that have several measures collected across, or the same measures collected across different countries in Europe, it's just a rich opportunity to try to study that further. I think that's a great direction to go. But I have questions about it. I just haven't been able to look into that, and so I'm happy that Jessica did.
The about the conversational and standardized approach.
Yeah.
Your results look like we could maybe would be a good idea to combine both approaches. Okay, conversational approach works really well, but not with all questions. There are some types of questions which are maybe not suitable for this approach. And then it would be maybe very interesting to find out which.
Exactly. Like this.
Provide suggestions and
yeah, that's the practical recommendation that we make at the end of both of these papers is to say, you know, this kind of older school thought. It's kind of like survey managers have taken this kind of Bayesian versus frequentist view on how interviewing should be conducted, and they only put themselves in one camp. It should only ever be standardized. It should only ever be conversational, and that's just naive and it's not well informed. So the recommendation that we make is for a particular type of question, conversational interviewing would be better to employ. For other questions, there's no need to go off on tangents. So give the interviewers more flexibility to explain certain types of questions, but restrict them a bit on other types of questions, and not, you know, try to you know, step in with their own interpretation or whatever the case may be on more direct factual questions. So I 100% agree with you, and that's exactly what we tried to say in this paper. Yeah.
We thought about the effect that it has depending on the respondent part. I mean, we're only thinking from the perspective of the interviewer, but it might be that for some respondents, like the respondents or respondents with a lower education level, some type of training would be better, some type of interview would be better.
Yeah, better.
So
that's a great question.
In terms of complexity, the question is, I mean, you only consulting for the type of training that you gave the respondent, but you haven't shown more how did you actually ask?
Yeah. So something else we could do with these data is to stratify the respondent pool into like different levels of education or some other directly observable feature, and see if the same CI versus SI differences persist. But we only had 1,850 responses to work with. Like this was a 4-month data collection. We had like a 25% response rate in 15 different areas of Germany. So we can't parse the data set too finely across these different dimensions given the sample size. Because we did a power analysis that said we need at least 1,800 observations to be able to compare these various components. So we try to do that with different subgroups. Perfectly valid question, but we would need a lot of data. And if it wasn't based on an experimental design, it might be difficult to have enough sample to do that comparison within very specific response subgroups. But that's a perfectly valid question. I agree. Everything we've done is just focused from the interviewer perspective, but it's entirely possible that conversational may be much more effective for lower education or whatever it is going to be. Great. Yeah. Yes. So Simon Kuhn just presented on this at A4. So he's taking the angle of the way that interviewers are trained. What's the respondents' perception of the interviewer's beliefs and thoughts and approaches to asking these questions, and what's the interviewer's perception of what the respondent thinks and so forth. And he, as part of his dissertation, he's collecting data from both angles and seeing how they interact. So he's working on that really closely right now. And what he's found is that when you control for that respondent perception of the way the interviewer is approaching, interviewer experience basically goes away. Like he's got his finger on a really interesting area right now. He just presented that work at April this year. So that's good. That's related to his dissertation. That's going to be coming out soon. So that's a fascinating angle on there.